There may come a day when historians look back at this exact moment as the point where the world's tightest alliance began to fracture. For over 50 years, the United States and Canada have stood side by side, guarding North American skies like two watchmen sharing a single post. They are neighbors, massive trading partners, and deeply integrated military allies. People used to call this bond indestructible, but today the ground is shifting. Surprised, the friction now bleeding out between Washington and Ottawa would have been brushed off as pure fiction just a couple of years ago. There may come a day when historians look back at this exact moment as the point where the world's tightest alliance began to fracture. For over 50 years, the United States and Canada have stood side by side, guarding North American skies like two watchmen sharing a single post. They are neighbors, massive trading partners, and deeply integrated military allies. People used to call this bond indestructible, but today the ground is shifting. The friction now bleeding out between Washington and Ottawa would have been brushed off as pure fiction just a couple of years ago. Ottawa has just made a pivot that the US government never saw coming and absolutely hates. This pivot involves one of the largest, most critical military investments in Canada's modern history, and it has set off a geopolitical wildfire currently blazing on both sides of the border. This isn't just a debate about buying airplanes. It cuts to the very core of national sovereignty, global power, and who truly dictates the defense of North America. And into this powder keg steps Donald Trump. If you're familiar with his brand of politics, you know exactly what his playbook looks like when an allied nation pushes back. He doesn't do quiet diplomacy. He doesn't negotiate softly in the shadows. He takes it to the microphones loudly and aggressively. And that is precisely the scenario unfolding right now. Trump's reaction to Canada's reluctance has been fierce, uncompromising, and heavily laced with threats, sending ripples of panic through diplomatic networks in both nations. A standard military procurement choice has mutated into a full-blown continental crisis. We are staring down the barrel of a showdown over the fundamental future of North American defense. Because the moment Canada hinted it might ignore Washington's demands, the US retaliated so sharply that Canadians are now asking a previously unthinkable question. Is America treating Canada like a sovereign partner, or just a subordinate territory? Before we rush to any judgments, we have to look back at how this powder keg was packed. This narrative doesn't start with Donald Trump, nor does it begin with a modern stealth fighter contract. The origins of this clash trace back over 6 decades to the peak of the Cold War, when both nations were staring down a nightmarish threat descending from the freezing Arctic skies. To grasp why today's tension is so dangerously high, you have to understand the bedrock military pact that has shielded this continent for generations. That pact is called NORAD. If we want to understand the sudden animosity between Washington and Ottawa, we must rewind to the year 1958. The Cold War was reaching its most terrifying stage. Both the US and Canada were gripped by the exact same fear: Soviet nuclear bombers crossing the Arctic Circle to devastate North America with zero warning. The map was brutal. The quickest route from the Soviet Union to America's heartland went straight over the polar region, which meant flying directly through Canadian airspace. Neither nation had the resources to guard that colossal expanse of frozen wasteland alone. The Arctic was simply too massive, too remote, and too unforgiving. So, the two nations pulled off a historic compromise. Instead of guarding their borders individually, they merged their air defenses into a single, unified shield. They built a joint military command to monitor North American skies as one cohesive unit. That entity became the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. From day one, NORAD relied on one profound principle: absolute cooperation. American and Canadian radar installations were wired together across the continent. Live data flowed between both militaries in real time. Fighter squadrons from either nation could be launched in seconds to intercept airborne threats anywhere on the continent. The leadership structure perfectly mirrored this deep trust. The top commander would always be a four-star American general, backed by a Canadian deputy commander. For over 60 years, this machine ran flawlessly. It survived the Cold War, outlasted the collapse of the Soviet Union, and adapted to modern global threats. NORAD remained one of the most stable military partnerships anywhere on the planet. It worked so seamlessly that everyday citizens practically forgot it existed. It was just an invisible shield, quietly keeping watch every second of the day. However, behind closed doors, a very different kind of crisis was creeping up. It wasn't a foreign missile or a rogue bomber, it was an aging fleet. Canada's Air Force was getting dangerously old. For decades, the CF-18 Hornet had been the workhorse of Canadian skies, faithfully completing NORAD missions right alongside American fighters. But as the 2020s arrived, those aircraft were showing their age. Upkeep costs were skyrocketing, and their technological capabilities were lagging severely behind modern adversaries. Ottawa desperately needed a next-generation fighter jet, and the government knew the decision could not be delayed any longer. So in 2021, Ottawa officially kicked off a formal international bidding war. Several aerospace giants jumped into the race, but the technical reviews pointed to a definitive champion. The winner was the American-made F-35 Lightning II, manufactured by Lockheed Martin. On the surface, the roadmap was incredibly simple. Canada would purchase 88 F-35s and thoroughly modernize its Air Force. The choice seemed to validate the deep military integration between the US and Canada, cementing their NORAD partnership for decades to come. But then a variable entered the mix that Washington vastly underestimated. Politics warped the equation, and the entire dynamic began to shift. Initially, the F-35 purchase felt like a done deal. From a purely tactical standpoint, the aircraft had completely won the competition. It boasted elite stealth, cutting-edge sensors, and flawless networking with American hardware, ensuring NORAD operations would be tighter and smoother than ever. On paper, everything was perfectly aligned. But politics notoriously ruins perfect theories. Shortly after the evaluations wrapped up, the political landscape in Canada started to pivot. A new government took power under Prime Minister Mark Carney, and the overarching relationship between Ottawa and Washington grew far more complicated. Trade wars were heating up. American tariffs were squeezing Canadian industries, and slowly, a provocative new conversation began circulating among Canadian voters. Was Canada becoming completely dependent on the United States? That question wasn't just echoing at the ballot box, it was ringing through Canada's defense establishment. If their entire Air Force relied on American jets, American replacement parts, American software updates, and American supply chains, How much true control would Canada really retain over its own military destiny? Suddenly, a jet that had lost the initial bidding war caught their eye once again. That competitor was the Swedish built Saab Gripen. Now, in a pure dogfight simulation or technical evaluation, the Gripen hadn't outclassed the F 35. But the Swedish proposal brought a completely different weapon to the table, one that deeply resonated with Canadian politicians and workers alike. Saab proposed that a massive chunk of the Gripen fleet could be manufactured right on Canadian soil. Assembly lines could open in Ontario and Quebec. Local aerospace firms would handle the manufacturing and ongoing maintenance. The economic boom would be staggering. Projections showed the deal could generate roughly 12,600 Canadian jobs. These wouldn't be fleeting gigs. They were long-term careers in manufacturing, engineering, and high-tech sectors. In simple terms, Canada wouldn't just be buying a jet, they would be building a major part of it at home. Even more importantly, the Gripen gave Ottawa greater autonomous control over its own weapon systems. Without relying entirely on strict American export laws and supply chains, Canada could manage a higher degree of independence regarding software upgrades, repairs, and daily operational decisions. And the Canadian public loved the sound of that. Polls quickly painted a vivid picture. Around 43% of Canadians supported ditching the F, 35% to buy the Swedish Gripen exclusively. Another 29% favored a hybrid fleet combining different aircraft types. When you combine those numbers, nearly 70% of the country was signaling profound discomfort with an all F-35 monopoly. That isn't just a minor political blip. That was a tidal wave. The Carney administration read the room clearly. Protecting local manufacturing jobs while pushing back against American dominance was an absolute political goldmine. Standing up to Washington, at least symbolically, was turning into excellent politics. But there was a massive catch. Washington was scrutinizing every single move. And when US officials realized Ottawa might actually walk away from the full 88 Jet F-35 deal, the counterattack was fast, sharp, and deeply alarming to Canada's defense community. Because the response didn't sound like friendly advice. It sounded like an ultimatum. The warning dropped in late January of 2026, and it landed like a bombshell in Canadian defense circles. The man delivering it was the United States ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra. During an interview with CBC News, Canada's national broadcaster, Hoekstra said something that practically stopped everyone in their tracks. He suggested that if Canada backed away from purchasing all 88 F-35s, the foundational rules of the NORAD arrangement might have to be rewritten. Just pause and absorb that. For 67 years, NORAD was an untouchable pillar of global security, rooted in mutual trust and shared responsibility for guarding North America. But now, an American ambassador was going on national television to raise the very real threat that the core structure of that alliance could be altered. And Hoekstra kept pushing. He stated that if Canada opted for what he deemed an inferior product instead of the F-35, an obvious jab at the Swedish Gripen, it would degrade the entire continent's defense capabilities. According to him, Washington would then be forced to figure out how to compensate for that newly created security gap. The practical translation was chillingly obvious. The US military might start flying its own fighter squadrons directly over Canadian territory far more frequently to ensure the airspace remained secure. Technically speaking, NORAD already allows for jets to cross the border during active emergencies to intercept threats, regardless of whose airspace it is. There have been past incidents where American jets scrambled into Canadian skies, but those were extreme, mutually agreed upon emergencies. What Hoekstra was implying sounded entirely different. Instead of occasional emergency teamwork, he was talking about permanent, routine American military patrols in Canadian airspace, not because Ottawa asked for help, but because Washington no longer trusted Canada to carry its own weight. To many Canadians, this crossed the line from partnership to outright intimidation. The blowback in Ottawa was explosive. Former defense officials, security analysts, and political experts openly tore into the ambassador's comments. Andrea Sharon, a prominent NORAD scholar and director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies at the University of Manitoba, cautioned that publicly threatening your allies actually weakens the alliance's global credibility. When partners argue loudly in front of the world, she explained, adversaries take notice. Former National Security Advisor Vincent Rigby also weighed in, framing the ambassador's media blitz as a heavy-handed political shakedown rather than a formal shift in Pentagon doctrine. Rigby advised that while the threat couldn't be ignored, it shouldn't be automatically treated as official Pentagon strategy just yet. Regardless, the damage was already done. The message had resonated loudly from coast to coast. Washington was actively using its diplomatic muscle to bully Canada into buying American.